I used to work the night shift at Walmart. Most people assume that nothing exciting happens in a retail store after midnight. But those people have never stayed in the building when the fluorescent lights buzz like dying insects and the aisles stretch out like endless empty tunnels. For 3 years, I worked from 10 p.m. until 7 a.m., stocking shelves and handling overnight inventory. It was a lonely job, but the paycheck kept me afloat. Still, there were nights that made me question if staying in that building after dark was worth it. Nights when the silence felt alive. This particular incident happened in 2019 in a Walmart in rural Kentucky. I'll never forget it because I don't think I'll ever truly understand what I experienced. It was around 2 a.m. and I was working the toy aisle. You'd think that area would be harmless, shelves lined with dolls, action figures, stuffed animals, but under those fluorescent lights, the dolls' glassy eyes seemed to follow me. The longer I stalked, the more unsettled I felt. That night, though, something strange started happening. I'd turn away from my cart to load a shelf, and when I turned back, items inside the cart would be rearranged. At first, I thought I was tired. Maybe I put the items in the wrong spot without noticing. But after the third or fourth time, I realized it wasn't just me. The creepiest moment was when I placed a Barbie Dreamhouse box on the top shelf. I stepped back, grabbed the scanner gun, and when I turned around, there it was on the floor again, lying flat as if it had been placed there. I was alone in that aisle. At least I thought I was. Around 3 a.m., I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The store was huge, and walking through empty aisles at night was oddly therapeutic. But that night, I heard something that froze me in place. Footsteps, not the squeak of a coworker's shoes on the polished floor. These footsteps were heavier, slower, and they echoed in a way that didn't match the building. They seemed to come from several aisles over, then suddenly from right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a manager or maybe another overnight stalker. But no one was there. The aisles stretched long and empty, lit in that artificial blue-white glow. I stood still, holding my breath, and the footsteps started again. But this time, they were coming from both ends of the aisle, as if someone, or two someones, were closing in on me. I panicked and bolted straight into the frozen food section. The blast of cold air from the freezers should have calmed me, but the glass doors reflected things that didn't make sense. Shapes, shadows, figures that shouldn't have been there. Around 4 a.m., I regrouped and went back to my assigned section. That's when I saw her, a woman. She was standing in aisle 14, the seasonal aisle, where we kept the holiday displays. She wore a pale blue dress, her hair long and dark, covering part of her face. At first, I thought she was a late-night shopper who had somehow slipped in, though customers weren't allowed past midnight. "Ma'am?" I called out. She didn't move. Her head was tilted down, and her hands dangled at her sides like broken marionettes. I hesitated for a moment, then took a cautious step forward. That's when she glided into the next aisle. Not walked. Glided. I rushed after her, but when I turned the corner, the aisle was empty. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I swear I could still hear her dress brushing against the floor tiles, even though no one was there. By the time my shift ended at 7 a.m., I was shaking. I didn't even bother clocking out properly. I just found the overnight manager, David, and told him what I saw. He gave me this exhausted look, like he'd heard it before, then walked me back to the security office. We pulled up the cameras, fast-forwarding to the time I claimed to see the woman. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The aisles were empty. I felt my stomach sink. Maybe I really was losing it. Maybe I hallucinated from exhaustion. But then, there she was, clear as day. A woman in a pale blue dress standing motionless in the seasonal aisle. David froze the footage, staring at the screen with wide eyes. Then she did something that made my blood turn cold. She turned, slowly, and looked straight at the camera. The moment her face was fully visible, the feed cut out. Static, then black. When it came back, the aisle was empty again. I tried not to return to that Walmart after that night, but bills piled up and jobs weren't easy to find. Against my better judgment, I went back for one last overnight shift a week later. This time, the atmosphere was different, heavier. It was as if the building knew I was scared. Every corner, every aisle, every reflective surface seemed to hide something just out of sight. Around 2:45 a.m., the power flickered. The lights dimmed, then came back brighter than before. My cart was gone. Just gone, like it had been swallowed by the building. That's when I heard it. A voice, whispering, coming from the intercom system. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't music. It was a woman's voice, whispering my name. My real name. Over and over again, drawn out in this sing-song tone. I ran to the break room, but even there, the voice followed. I unplugged the speakers, and still, I heard it. And then I saw her again. The woman in the blue dress. This time, she was standing right outside the break room door, her head bent at that unnatural angle. Her face was wrong, like a mask stretched too tight over a skull. I blinked, and she was gone. I finally quit the job after that, packed up, left town, never looked back. But 2 weeks later, I got a text from David, the overnight manager. It was a photo from the security cameras. Not from the night I saw her, not from any night I worked there. It was from the hiring day, my first interview. And in the background, standing in the seasonal aisle, blurry but unmistakable, was the woman in the blue dress. She'd been there before I ever started. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to share something like this online, but there's a weight on me that hasn't left in years, and maybe writing it down will loosen it. I used to live in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where Walmart wasn't just a store. It was the center of everything. You needed groceries? Walmart. You wanted to meet friends? Walmart. You were bored on a Friday night? You drove to Walmart and walked the aisles until closing. It sounds ridiculous, but when you grow up with nothing around you but fields and highways, Walmart becomes its own universe. This story takes place when I was 22. I had just moved back in with my mom after a breakup, and I found myself wandering Walmart late at night almost every other day. It was open 24 hours back then, and for me, it became a kind of escape. The glow of the fluorescent lights, the faint hum of the refrigerators in the frozen section, it gave me something to do, something familiar. But there was one night when all of that comfort turned into a nightmare I've never been able to shake. It was close to 1 a.m. when I walked into the store. I remember clearly because the parking lot was nearly empty, just a few scattered cars. The store felt quieter than usual, almost hollow, like the kind of silence you hear in a church after everyone has left. I wandered toward the electronics section because I liked flipping through DVDs, even though I rarely bought one. That's when I noticed him. He was standing at the end of the aisle, just staring at the display of televisions. He was tall, unnervingly thin, and his clothes looked a little outdated, like something you'd see in a thrift store from the 80s. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, and his head was tilted up toward the screens. But what unsettled me was that the TVs weren't even turned on. They were just reflecting the aisle lights in their glossy black surfaces. I stood there for a minute, pretending to browse, but my stomach tightened the longer I looked at him. There was something unnatural about the way he was standing, too still, like his body didn't need to shift or breathe. Eventually I moved on, telling myself it was just some weird guy passing time. But every aisle I went down, I felt like he was near. By the time I made it to the home goods section, I realized he was definitely following me. Not directly, not in a way that would make it obvious. But whenever I turned a corner and glanced back, I'd catch sight of him, always at the far end of the aisle, always standing perfectly still, as if he'd been there the whole time. I tried to test it. I went from housewares to the toy section, then to groceries. Each time I'd think I'd lost him. But then I'd catch that same thin figure lingering at the end of the row, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted. The strangest part was that no one else seemed to notice. A few employees were stocking shelves, a couple of shoppers were pushing carts, but no one looked twice at him. At one point, I got brave enough to glance directly at his face. My stomach flipped. He wasn't staring at me or at the shelves, or even at the space around him. His eyes were wide open, but they weren't moving. They were glazed over, like someone in a deep trance, or like someone who wasn't alive. That's when the store intercom crackled. A distorted voice said something I couldn't make out, but the moment it ended, the man in the aisle took one slow, deliberate step toward me. I abandoned my cart and walked quickly toward the front, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I reached the self-checkout lanes, they were all turned off. The registers, too. Even the lights above them had gone dark. I looked around, panicked, trying to spot an employee. The entire front of the store was deserted. I rushed to the exit doors, only to find them locked. That was impossible. Walmart never locked their doors, especially not when they were open 24 hours. I pushed on them until my palms hurt, but they didn't budge. That's when I heard the sound. Shoes against tile. Slow, measured footsteps, echoing down from the back of the store. He was coming. I ran. I didn't even think about where I was going. I just darted down the nearest aisle and kept moving. My chest ached, my lungs burned, but all I could focus on was putting as much distance as I could between myself and the man. I must have turned down half a dozen rows before I realized something was wrong. The aisle I was in, it didn't belong. I knew that store like the back of my hand. Every section, every layout, every display. But this aisle was different. The shelves stretched taller than the others, almost to the ceiling, packed with items I didn't recognize. Old toys in faded boxes, VHS tapes with no covers, clothing tags from brands that didn't exist anymore. And the farther I walked, the more the shelves seemed to bend inward, like they were closing me in. I spun around to go back, but the entrance to the aisle was gone. Just another wall of shelves, stacked high with dusty products. I was trapped. The overhead lights flickered, then dimmed. The buzzing sound from the fluorescent tubes grew louder, like a swarm of insects trapped above me. And then, over the speakers, I heard it again. The intercom crackle. But this time, the voice was clear. "Don't let him find you." I froze. The voice was calm, almost gentle, but it made my skin crawl. It sounded female, but distorted, like it was being played backward and forward at the same time. "Don't let him find you," it repeated. "Don't let him find you." The sound echoed endlessly, until suddenly, it stopped. And in the silence, I realized I could hear breathing. I turned slowly, my entire body trembling. At the far end of the impossible aisle, he was standing there, the thin man. Only this time he wasn't still. He was walking toward me, step by step, his feet dragging against the tile. His head twitched with every few steps, like a puppet whose strings were being yanked. I backed up until my shoulders hit the shelf behind me. My mouth went dry, and I could feel the cold metal pressing into my spine. He got closer and closer, until I could finally see his face in detail. It wasn't just empty. It wasn't just lifeless. It was wrong. His features looked blurred, like a photograph smudged with water. His mouth moved, but the words didn't match the sound. What came out was a distorted static, the same noise I'd heard from the intercom. And then, he stopped, inches from me. He leaned in close enough that I could feel his breath and whispered something that nearly made me collapse. He said my name. I don't remember how I got out. My memory after that moment is fractured, like pieces of glass scattered across the floor. The next thing I knew, I was outside in the parking lot, the morning sun blinding me. My car was parked where I left it, keys still in my pocket. I told myself it was a nightmare, that I must have fallen asleep somewhere inside the store. But when I checked my phone, I found a new photo saved in my gallery. A photo I didn't take. It was of me, standing in that impossible aisle. My face pale, my body blurred, as if I'd been caught mid-scream. And in the corner of the photo, towering behind me, was him, the thin man. I used to think the strangest thing about working at Walmart was the customers who came in late at night, drunk or half asleep, wandering the aisles like ghosts. But the truth is, The customers weren't the scariest part of that building. It was the store itself. The place had a way of changing when the sun went down, like the walls stretched farther, the air grew heavier, and time itself didn't flow the same. I worked there for 6 months during the graveyard shift, and although there were a handful of nights that left me uneasy, there was one that scarred me so deeply I never went back. It happened on a Tuesday in the middle of summer. The air conditioning inside was running too cold, so cold that I could see my breath when I pushed carts back from the entrance. I chalked it up to the AC being broken, but deep down it felt like the chill was coming from somewhere else, as though the building itself was radiating cold. My shift started at 11 p.m., and by 1:30 a.m., the store was so quiet that every sound, the beeping of scanners, the wheels of a cart, the hum of the coolers, seemed amplified. I was assigned to stock the cleaning supplies aisle that night, which was toward the back, far away from the few customers who straggled in after midnight. That's when I noticed the smell. At first it was faint, like something metallic lingering in the air, but it grew stronger the longer I worked. It wasn't bleach or ammonia or anything you'd normally associate with cleaning products. It was sharp, almost sweet, like the air before a thunderstorm mixed with the smell of rust. I tried to ignore it, but as I moved down the aisle placing bottles on shelves, the odor followed me, creeping into my nose until I could practically taste it on my tongue. Halfway down the aisle, I noticed something odd. One of the shelves had a gap in the back where the metal panel didn't sit flush against the wall. Behind it was nothing but darkness, a narrow space that looked too deep to be a normal gap. I leaned closer, trying to peer inside, and that's when I heard the sound. Breathing. It was faint, ragged, and it came from the darkness beyond the shelf. I jerked back so hard I almost knocked over my cart. My first thought was that maybe a homeless person had crawled back there, but the space looked far too narrow for anyone to fit. Still, the breathing continued, shallow and labored, until suddenly it stopped altogether, replaced by absolute silence. I told myself I was imagining it. I forced myself to finish the aisle, but the smell kept getting worse. When I turned around to grab another box from the cart, I froze. Someone had placed an item on the shelf behind me. I hadn't heard it, hadn't seen anyone come by, but there it was. An old bottle of cleaner with a faded label, something I'd never seen in the store before. The logo looked decades old, and the liquid inside was dark and thick, not the usual bright blue or green you'd expect. I picked it up, and the moment my hand touched the bottle, I felt a pulse, like a faint heartbeat. I dropped it immediately, and the bottle didn't shatter, didn't even roll. It just sat there, upright, as though glued to the shelf. I backed out of the aisle, abandoning my cart, and headed toward the break room to get my head straight. On the way, I passed by the cameras mounted in the corners, and for some reason I glanced up. The little red recording light was off. Every single camera I passed was dead. No blinking lights, no movement, just black, glassy eyes staring down at me. When I got to the break room, I found it empty, though I knew at least 2 other coworkers were supposed to be on shift with me. The table in the center had a styrofoam cup sitting on it, half full of coffee that was still steaming, as if someone had just been there. But the silence in the room was so total, so unnatural, that I knew I was completely alone. I tried to shake the feeling, grabbed my phone from my locker, and decided to call it quits for the night. No paycheck was worth whatever was happening in that store. Except when I pulled my phone out, the screen was black. Not dead, not powered off. It looked more like it was stuck, frozen on a blank screen. I pressed every button I could, but nothing worked. That's when I heard the breathing again. This time it was louder, clearer, and it was coming from directly behind the break room door. I held my breath, waiting, and after several seconds, the handle started to turn. Slowly. Deliberately. I panicked, yanked open my locker, and grabbed the small box cutter I kept inside. The door creaked open an inch, then 2, and for a split second, I saw something I can never unsee. A face. But it wasn't human. It was pale, grayish, and stretched too thin over bone. The eyes were hollow, sunken pits, and the mouth hung open like it had been torn wider than it was ever meant to go. And yet, somehow, it looked familiar. Not because I'd seen it before, but because it looked like an echo of my own face. Like some warped reflection of me, hollowed out and rotting. The door swung shut as quickly as it had opened, and I stood there, paralyzed, listening to the sound of retreating footsteps. After a long silence, I finally gathered the courage to step out into the hallway. It was empty, but the lights overhead flickered, and for the first time, I noticed that the hum of the fluorescence was gone. The building was too quiet, unnervingly quiet, as if even the electricity had stopped moving. I made my way toward the front, desperate to get out, and when I reached the checkout area, I saw someone standing near the registers. It was one of my co-workers, or at least I thought it was. From behind, the figure had the same blue vest, the same stance, but when I called out their name, the figure didn't turn. It just stood there, motionless. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing across the empty floor, and when I got close enough to see their face, I realized with horror that it wasn't my coworker at all. It was that same gray, hollow version of me, standing still, staring straight ahead with dead eyes. Before I could react, the front doors slid open on their own. No one had touched them. No sensor had been triggered, but they parted anyway, revealing the night outside. Without a second thought, I sprinted for the exit, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, and when I finally looked back, the doors had closed again. The figure was gone. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. I even considered going back to work, just to prove to myself it hadn't been real. But when I checked my phone again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Somehow, a new note had been added to my phone's notepad app, time-stamped at 2:14 a.m., the exact moment I was in that break room. The note was only 3 words long, but I can't get them out of my head even now. It said, "See you soon." I never believed in ghosts. I thought all those haunted Walmart stories online were nothing more than urban legends spun by bored employees. That was until I had my own experience, one that rattled me so badly that to this day, I can't set foot inside a Walmart without breaking into a cold sweat. It was November of 2016, just a week before Thanksgiving, and the store I worked at was already packed with holiday inventory. Mountains of boxes, pallets wrapped in plastic, and half-assembled displays cluttered the aisles. The overnight crew had been working 12-hour shifts to keep up with the chaos, and by 3 a.m. that night, I was exhausted. I'd been in the back room moving pallets of canned goods when I decided to sneak into the main store for a quick breather. The building was eerily quiet compared to the usual daytime madness. Aisles stretched out in both directions, lit by the pale flicker of fluorescent lights. I wandered down toward the clothing section, where racks of sweaters and jackets stood like silent sentinels. That's when I noticed the mannequins. We had 3 of them set up near the front, each dressed in winter gear. Normally, I barely gave them a glance, but something about them felt wrong that night. They looked different. Their heads were tilted at strange angles, their limbs bent slightly out of place as though someone had moved them in a hurry. And then one of them twitched. At first, I thought I was seeing things. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and stared again. One of the mannequin's hands had shifted from its side to the edge of the rack. It wasn't possible. These were just plastic forms bolted to a base. But the longer I watched, the more convinced I became that it had moved. I backed away slowly, my stomach tightening, and decided to head toward the electronics section, where I knew a couple coworkers were supposed to be stocking shelves. But when I turned the corner, the aisle stretched empty. No carts, no boxes, no people. Just silence. I checked my watch. It was 3:12 a.m. And that's when I realized something deeply unsettling. There should have been at least 4 other people on shift with me, but I hadn't seen a single soul since I left the back room. I walked faster now, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The store felt bigger than usual, like the aisles had elongated, stretching farther than I remembered. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the walls as though I were in a cavern instead of a retail store. And then, I heard another sound. Footsteps, but not mine. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They came from behind me, but every time I spun around, the aisle was empty. By the time I reached the frozen food section, my nerves were shot. I pressed my hands against the cold glass of the freezer doors, trying to steady myself. That's when I saw the reflection. Standing a few aisles behind me was a figure, tall and thin, its body motionless. At first, I thought it was one of my coworkers playing a prank, but the reflection was wrong. The figure's proportions weren't human. Its arms were too long, its neck too thin, its face a pale blur without features. I whipped around, but the aisle was empty. When I looked back at the freezer door, the reflection was still there, closer this time, right behind me. I bolted. My sneakers squeaked against the tiles as I tore through the store, desperate to find someone, anyone. But every aisle I ran down was deserted, every checkout lane abandoned. The world outside the glass doors at the entrance looked frozen, like a photograph. Cars in the parking lot perfectly still, not a single gust of wind moving through the trees. It was as if the entire world had stopped except for me. I ducked into the employees-only hallway, hoping to find safety in the break room. But when I reached for the door, it wasn't there. The wall stretched unbroken where the break room entrance should have been. I ran farther, searching for another familiar landmark, but the hallway had changed. It twisted and bent in ways that didn't make sense, stretching into impossible turns that led nowhere. That's when I heard it again. The mannequins. At least, I thought it was them. The sound of plastic scraping against tile echoed behind me, growing louder with every second. I turned and saw them in the distance, 3 pale shapes moving stiffly down the corridor, their limbs jerking unnaturally as though pulled by invisible strings. They were mannequins, yet somehow alive, their blank faces aimed straight at me. I sprinted until my lungs burned, finally bursting out into the main store again. I collapsed against a shelf, gasping for air, and when I looked up, I realized I was back in the clothing section where it had all started. The mannequins stood in front of me, perfectly still, their heads tilted at odd angles. Only now there were more of them, rows and rows blocking the aisle. And in the middle of them was one figure that wasn't plastic. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was dressed in the same Walmart vest I wore, but his face was smooth, blank, like a mannequin's. He raised his arm slowly, deliberately, and pointed directly at me. I stumbled backward, my body trembling, and as I did, every mannequin turned their heads in unison to follow me. Their necks cracked and popped as they rotated, their plastic jaws stretching open into grotesque smiles. The man in the vest lowered his arm and began to walk toward me, his steps heavy, echoing through the silent store. I turned and ran again, though every direction felt like a maze. Aisles twisted into each other, doors led nowhere, and no matter where I turned, I kept ending up back in the same place, the clothing section, with the mannequins waiting for me. Each time I returned, there were more of them, filling the space, closing in. Their plastic hands reached for me, their empty eyes boring into my soul. And then, just as suddenly as it began, I was outside. The automatic doors slid open, and I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping for air. The night sky stretched above me, stars twinkling, cars parked exactly as they should be. Everything was normal again. I never went back. I quit the next day, ignored every call from management, and packed up my things. But the story doesn't end there. A week later, I got a text from one of my old coworkers. It was a photo of the employee bulletin board. On it was a new staff photo lineup, with everyone's picture pinned neatly in rows. And there, among the familiar faces, was mine. Only it wasn't me. The face in the photo was smooth, blank, like a mannequin's. The night was unusually quiet. After the chaos of the previous days, I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, things had finally gone back to normal. I had stopped visiting that Walmart, of course. I couldn't even bring myself to drive past it without feeling my chest tighten. But the nightmares refused to leave. They clung to me like shadows stitched beneath my skin, and each time I closed my eyes, I was back in those fluorescent aisles, hearing footsteps behind me when no one was there. I knew something had followed me home, even though I couldn't explain it. My apartment used to be a sanctuary, a place where I could collapse on the couch after a long shift at work and drown myself in the soft glow of my TV. But now the rooms felt wrong, like I had stepped into a replica of my own life. The furniture was the same, the smells were familiar, but every corner hummed with an energy that made me uneasy, like I was being watched by something that knew me too well. It started with small things at first. I'd find my front door unlocked even though I was certain I had bolted it. My phone would be placed on the kitchen counter when I clearly remembered leaving it charging in my bedroom. One night I came home and found the fridge door wide open, the hum of its motor filling the silence. Nothing inside had been touched, but the door swayed slightly as if someone had just been there, standing in front of it moments before I walked in. I tried to convince myself that it was just stress, that I had become careless, distracted, forgetful. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever darkness lurked in that Walmart had slipped into my world, trailing me like a hunter that had marked its prey. The real terror came one night when I woke to the sound of my shower running. The hiss of water echoed through the thin walls of my apartment, muffled but unmistakable. My heart pounded so hard that it drowned out every other sound. I forced myself to move, pulling the covers off my trembling body and walking barefoot down the hall. The bathroom door was closed, steam curling out from underneath it. I stood there frozen, staring at the thin crack of light beneath the door, waiting for a shadow to move across it. After what felt like hours, I finally pushed it open. The shower was on, water splattering against the tiles, but the room was empty. Empty, except for something scratched into the fogged-up mirror. 3 words, written with a finger, each letter jagged and uneven, as though carved by something shaking with fury. "You belong here." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with every light on, clutching the kitchen knife in my hands, waiting for something to appear. But nothing did. Nothing except the oppressive sense that I had just been warned. I was losing my grip, spiraling deeper into paranoia. The next day, I tried to tell myself it was some cruel trick of my imagination, a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. But as I left for work, I noticed something wedged beneath my apartment door. It was a receipt, yellowed, crumpled, and damp. I unfolded it with trembling hands and nearly vomited when I saw where it was from. Walmart. The items listed weren't groceries or household goods. They were grotesque, impossible things. 1 human tooth, 1 strand of hair, 1 beating heart. The total amount was scratched out, replaced with a message scrawled in red ink: "Return required." That night, I didn't even bother pretending I could sleep. I sat awake, my thoughts unraveling, trying to understand what this thing wanted from me. The phrase "return required" burned in my mind, over and over. Did it mean I had to go back? Did it mean I never should have left? The walls of my apartment seemed to close in, the air thick and stifling. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the lights flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the room whole. And in that pitch-black silence, I heard the sound again. The same hollow, rhythmic footsteps I had heard in the aisles of Walmart, moving closer and closer to where I sat. The memory of that night never truly left me. Even now, when I walk into a Walmart during the late hours, I feel a tightening in my chest, as if something unseen is waiting for me among the shelves. The store's bright fluorescent lights might appear ordinary to most people, but to me, they always flicker just a little too long, as though they're straining to keep the darkness at bay. After what I went through, I can't look at aisles the same way again. There is always a sense that something could step out from behind the stacked cereal boxes or emerge from the racks of clothing, watching silently until it decides to come closer. A week after my initial encounter, I tried to tell myself it was all just stress. Maybe I had been hallucinating. Maybe lack of sleep was twisting my reality. I had convinced myself of that until one evening when I went back, determined to prove nothing was wrong. I told myself I wouldn't let fear keep me away from a simple store. It was around 11:30 p.m., and the parking lot was mostly empty. I parked close to the entrance and noticed how quiet everything was, almost unnaturally so. Even the faint hum of traffic in the distance seemed absent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Inside, things felt wrong almost immediately. I walked past the greeter, an older man who smiled at me with a strange stiffness in his expression, his eyes darting to the far corner of the store before quickly looking away. His silence was unsettling, as if he wanted to warn me but didn't dare speak. The aisles seemed longer than they should have been, stretching ahead in a way that didn't make sense, like they had grown in size since the last time I was there. Every time I turned a corner, I swore the shelves shifted slightly, as if the layout was changing on its own. The deeper I went into the store, the colder it became. At first, I thought it was just the air conditioning, but the cold carried a sharpness that cut into my skin. In the frozen food section, I heard the distinct sound of someone breathing behind me. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I froze, staring at the reflection in the freezer doors, but there was nothing there. When I turned around, the aisle was empty, and yet I could still hear it faintly, fading away as though whoever it was had simply melted into the air. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. I passed by the toy aisle, where I stopped dead in my tracks. A single doll sat in the middle of the floor. Its plastic face was turned toward me, and the faintest smile was carved into its lips. I bent down carefully, thinking maybe a child had dropped it, but when I reached for it, the doll's eyes seemed to flicker, not with light, but with life. I jerked back, stumbling, and the doll rolled slightly as if it had been pushed by something unseen. I didn't wait to find out more. I hurried away. As I made my way toward the electronics section, I realized that the store no longer felt like Walmart. The aisles twisted unnaturally, leading me in circles. The overhead announcements were warped, voices garbled like broken recordings, repeating words I couldn't understand. My reflection in the glossy floors seemed delayed, moving a fraction of a second slower than I did. I tried to find the exit, but the signs above no longer made sense, pointing in directions that led me deeper inside instead of out. That's when I saw it again. At the far end of an aisle, standing perfectly still, was a figure. Its body was tall and thin, wrapped in something dark that clung to its frame like wet fabric. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and though I couldn't make out its face, I knew it was staring at me. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, and in that instant it was closer, only a few aisles away. I didn't think. I just ran, weaving through shelves and racks, but no matter how far I went, the store seemed endless. Finally, I stumbled into the garden section, my chest heaving. The glass doors ahead should have led to the outside, but instead, beyond the glass, there was nothing but endless black. Not the night sky, not parking lot lights, just an infinite, consuming void. My reflection in the glass stared back at me, but its mouth was open in a silent scream, completely disconnected from my own terrified face. A sudden noise behind me, footsteps, slow and deliberate. I turned back, and the figure was standing only a few feet away, its head tilted further, bones cracking as it moved. The lights above flickered violently, and with each flicker it seemed closer. I backed up against the glass, but there was nowhere to go. My reflection began pounding on the glass from the other side, desperate to get out, while I stood frozen in place. The lights went out completely. Darkness swallowed everything. When they came back on, I was standing in the middle of the store entrance, holding a bag of groceries I didn't remember buying. The greeter was gone, the aisles were back to normal, and the world outside looked ordinary again. But as I left, walking quickly toward my car, I noticed the receipt in my hand. There were no items listed, no prices, no total, just a single sentence typed across the bottom. "You belong to us now."